Throughout history, espionage has been a deadly game of shadows, where nations stake their survival on the skills of their most secretive operatives. But sometimes, even the most carefully planned intelligence operations go spectacularly wrong. Today, we're diving into the most catastrophic spy blunders in recorded history, mistakes so monumentally stupid they changed the course of wars, toppled governments, and left intelligence agencies scrambling to clean up disasters of their own making. From double agents who forgot which side they were actually working for, to secret codes cracked by amateur radio enthusiasts, these aren't just simple mistakes. These are facepalm moments that prove even the world's most elite spies are capable of breathtakingly dumb decisions. Let's start with one of the most embarrassing intelligence failures in modern history. Picture this. World War II is raging, and British intelligence has just captured what they believe to be the perfect German spy to turn into a double agent. His name was Eddie Chapman, codenamed Agent Zigzag, and he seemed like the ideal candidate for deception operations. Chapman was a career criminal who had been recruited by the Germans, trained in sabotage, and parachuted into England with a mission to blow up an aircraft factory. The British captured him almost immediately and convinced him to work for them instead. So far, so good. Chapman was intelligent, charismatic, and had legitimate German credentials. The perfect double agent, right? Wrong. The spectacular blunder came when British handlers decided to let Chapman live it up in London while supposedly working undercover. They gave him money, women, and complete freedom to move around the city. Chapman, being a career criminal at heart, couldn't resist the temptation. He started robbing banks, seducing married women, and generally causing chaos throughout London. But here's where it gets truly stupid. The British intelligence services knew he was committing crimes and decided to just ignore it because they thought he was too valuable as a double agent. Meanwhile, Chapman was feeding information to both sides, skimming money from his handlers, and basically playing everyone for fools. The operation became such a mess that by the end of the war, nobody was entirely sure whose side Chapman was actually on, including Chapman himself, the real kicker. Years later, it was discovered that the Germans had suspected Chapman was compromised from almost the very beginning, but they kept feeding him false information just to see what the British would do with it. So the British thought they were running a brilliant double agent operation. The Germans knew it was compromised, but played along anyway. And Chapman just kept collecting paychecks from everyone while robbing banks on the side. It's like a spy novel written by someone who'd never actually read a spy novel. Our second catastrophic blunder takes us to the height of the Cold War, when the CIA launched what they thought was a brilliant psychological warfare operation against the Soviet Union. The year was 1953, and some genius in Langley decided that the best way to undermine communist morale was to flood Eastern Europe with balloons carrying anti-Soviet propaganda leaflets. They called it Operation Winds of Freedom, which should have been the first red flag that this was going to be a disaster. The plan was simple. Launch thousands of balloons from West Germany, let them drift over the Iron Curtain, and have them automatically release propaganda materials over major Soviet cities. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. First, the balloons had a nasty habit of drifting in completely random directions. Instead of hitting Moscow or Leningrad, they'd end up dropping leaflets on Polish farms or floating out to sea. Some balloons made it as far as Turkey, where confused Turkish officials had to explain to their Soviet counterparts why American propaganda was falling from the sky in Ankara. But the real disaster came when one balloon malfunctioned spectacularly over Prague. Instead of releasing leaflets, it caught fire and crashed into a crowded market square, injuring several civilians and starting a small riot. The Soviets had a field day with the propaganda value, claiming that the Americans were now literally raining terror from the sky onto innocent civilians. The operation got even worse when the Soviets started launching their own balloons back at Western Europe, except theirs were filled with actual garbage and dead animals. Soon, the skies over Central Europe were filled with dueling balloon armies, dropping increasingly bizarre payloads on bewildered civilians below. The CIA finally called off Operation Winds of Freedom after a Soviet balloon dropped a dead pig onto a NATO base in West Germany, causing a diplomatic incident that took months to resolve. The entire operation cost millions of dollars, achieved absolutely nothing except international embarrassment, and probably set back American-Soviet relations by several years. It's the kind of plan that sounds brilliant at 2 in the morning, but falls apart the moment you actually think about physics, weather patterns, or basic common sense. The third blunder on our list involves one of the most sophisticated spy gadgets ever created, and how it was completely undone by the most mundane oversight imaginable. During the 1970s, the KGB developed what they called the Thing, a listening device so advanced it seemed like science fiction. This wasn't your typical bug hidden in a lamp or behind a picture frame. The Thing was a passive resonance cavity that could be activated remotely and was virtually undetectable by conventional sweeping equipment. Soviet agents managed to plant one inside a carved wooden seal that was presented as a gift to the American ambassador in Moscow. For years, this device transmitted conversations from the ambassador's private study directly to KGB listening posts. It was a masterpiece of espionage technology, and the Americans had no idea they were being monitored. The device was so sophisticated that when American technicians finally discovered it in 1952, they couldn't figure out how it worked for months. It had no batteries, no wires, and no obvious electronic components, yet it was clearly transmitting radio signals. Here's where the spectacular stupidity comes in. The KGB operation was blown not by counterintelligence experts or advanced detection equipment, but by a British radio operator who was randomly scanning frequencies as a hobby. He kept picking up what sounded like conversations in English with a Russian accent. Being a curious sort, he started listening regularly and eventually realized he was eavesdropping on classified American diplomatic communications. He reported this to British intelligence, who investigated and discovered the Thing. The Soviets had created the most advanced listening device in history, successfully planted it in the most sensitive location possible, and operated it undetected for years. But they forgot to encrypt the transmitted conversations or use frequency hopping to avoid detection by amateur radio enthusiasts. It's like building the perfect bank vault and then leaving the combination written on a sticky note attached to the door. The entire operation was undone by a guy with a radio hobby who happened to be scanning the right frequency at the right time. Moving on to our fourth intelligence disaster, we need to talk about the Great Seal bug incident's aftermath and how the Americans managed to turn their own counterintelligence victory into an embarrassing defeat. After discovering the Soviet listening device, American intelligence decided to turn the tables and feed disinformation back to the Soviets through the compromised communication channel. This should have been a straightforward operation. Continue using the ambassador's study for meetings, but make sure only false or misleading information was discussed there. The plan was to gradually feed the Soviets incorrect intelligence about American diplomatic positions and military capabilities. It was a brilliant idea that could have provided enormous strategic advantages during the height of the Cold War. Unfortunately, the execution was handled by people who apparently learned their tradecraft from watching Three Stooges films. The first problem was coordination. Multiple American intelligence agencies were involved in the operation, but nobody bothered to create a master list of what false information was being fed to the Soviets. The CIA was telling one set of lies, military intelligence was telling another set of lies, and the State Department was telling a third set of lies. The result was that the disinformation being transmitted was completely contradictory and obviously fake. The Soviets quickly realized that the Americans knew about the bug and were feeding them false information, but instead of shutting down the operation, both sides decided to keep playing the game. The Americans continued feeding obviously false information, the Soviets continued pretending to believe it, and everyone involved continued filing reports about how successful their brilliant counterintelligence operation was going. This continued for months, with both sides knowing the other side knew, but neither side wanting to admit that their supposedly sophisticated spy games had devolved into an elaborate farce. The situation became so absurd that American intelligence officers started making jokes about what ridiculous lies they could get the Soviets to pretend to believe. Someone suggested claiming that the United States was planning to invade the Soviet Union using trained dolphins, and apparently this actually made it into one of the fake diplomatic conversations. The operation finally ended when a junior CIA analyst wrote a memo pointing out that they were spending enormous amounts of time and money to lie to people who knew they were lying, while those people were spending enormous amounts of time and money to pretend they believed lies they knew were lies. It was like an international intelligence version of an improv comedy show, except nobody was laughing, and it was costing taxpayers millions of dollars. Our fifth spectacular spy failure takes us to Nazi Germany and demonstrates how paranoia and bureaucratic incompetence can completely destroy even the most well-funded intelligence operations. The Abwehr, Nazi Germany's military intelligence service, was convinced that the Allies were planning to invade Europe somewhere along the Atlantic coast. This was, of course, absolutely correct, but the Germans were determined to figure out exactly where and when this invasion would take place. They launched an ambitious spy operation to infiltrate British intelligence and discover the Allied invasion plans. The operation involved recruiting German agents who would pose as refugees fleeing Nazi persecution, allowing them to be captured by the Allies, and then having them volunteer to work for British intelligence as double agents. It was actually a clever plan that might have worked if it had been executed by competent people instead of Nazi bureaucrats. The first sign that this operation was doomed came during the training phase. The German agents being prepared for this mission were trained by instructors who had never actually been to Britain and whose knowledge of British culture came entirely from pre-war tourist guidebooks and Hollywood movies. These agents were taught to blend in by doing things like always drinking tea at exactly 4 o'clock, constantly talking about the weather, and saying "cheerio old chap" in every conversation. They were given forged identity documents that claimed they were from places like Broome and the Smoke, because their instructors thought these were actual British city names instead of slang terms for Birmingham and London. One agent was instructed to claim he was from Piccadilly Circus because his handler thought it was a neighborhood rather than a famous intersection. But the real disaster came when these poorly trained agents actually arrived in Britain. They were so obviously fake that British counterintelligence officers started competing to see who could spot the German spies fastest. One agent was caught because he tried to pay for a pint of beer with a German coin. Another was caught because he asked for directions to Piccadilly Circus, the neighborhood. A third was caught because he insisted on drinking his tea with the little finger extended, apparently believing this was how all British people drank tea. The British quickly realized they had stumbled onto a massive German spy operation, but instead of simply arresting all the agents, they decided to turn them into double agents and feed false information back to Germany. This led to the brilliant Allied deception campaign that convinced the Germans the D-Day invasion would happen at Calais instead of Normandy. So the German spy operation didn't just fail, it actively contributed to Germany's defeat by providing the Allies with a perfect channel for strategic deception. The Nazis spent enormous resources training and deploying spies who were so incompetent they became unwitting Allied assets. Our sixth catastrophic intelligence blunder involves the Soviet Union's attempt to steal American atomic bomb secrets and how they managed to turn a successful espionage operation into a public relations nightmare that damaged their cause for decades. The Soviets had successfully infiltrated the Manhattan Project through several high-level sources, including Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist working on the bomb program. This was actually one of the most successful spy operations in history, allowing the Soviets to develop nuclear weapons years earlier than they otherwise could have. The intelligence they gathered was accurate, detailed, and incredibly valuable. So naturally, Soviet intelligence decided to completely screw it up through a combination of paranoia, bureaucratic stupidity, and spectacular poor judgment. The problem started when Soviet handlers decided they didn't trust their own sources and began demanding increasingly detailed proof that the intelligence was genuine. They required their agents to steal not just technical documents, but also administrative paperwork, personnel files, and even cafeteria menus from Los Alamos. The theory was that having mundane details would prove the technical intelligence was authentic. In practice, this meant their agents were taking enormous risks to steal completely useless information while also stealing actually valuable secrets. The situation became so absurd that Klaus Fuchs was spending as much time photographing office supply requisitions as he was copying bomb designs. But the real stupidity came when Soviet intelligence decided to verify the stolen information by having their agents steal the same documents multiple times from different sources. They wanted to make sure the Americans weren't feeding them false information, so they had different spy networks targeting the same objectives independently. This created a situation where multiple Soviet agents were wandering around Los Alamos trying to steal the same documents, dramatically increasing the chances that someone would get caught. And of course, someone did get caught. Several someones, actually. The overlapping spy operations started tripping over each other, leading to a series of arrests that exposed the entire Soviet intelligence network. The final nail in the coffin came when the Soviets decided to test whether the stolen atomic bomb information was accurate by actually building a bomb based on the stolen plans. This seems reasonable in theory, but they decided to test it immediately, without any attempt to disguise the fact that their bomb design was identical to the American design. When the Soviet Union detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949, American scientists immediately recognized their own work. It was like copying someone's homework and then turning it in with their name still on it. The Soviets had successfully stolen the atomic bomb, but they had done it in such an obvious and ham-fisted way that it became a massive propaganda victory for the United States, which could now claim that the Soviets were only a nuclear power because they were thieves and cheaters. The seventh entry in our parade of intelligence failures takes us to East Germany and the Stasi's obsession with monitoring their own citizens. The Stasi was arguably the most surveillance-heavy intelligence service in history, with an estimated 1 in 3 East German citizens serving as informants. They had files on millions of people, recorded countless hours of conversations, and photographed everything that moved. It was a totalitarian surveillance state's wet dream, and it was also completely useless because the Stasi was drowning in their own data. The organization had become so obsessed with collecting information that they had completely lost the ability to analyze or act on any of it. By the 1980s, the Stasi was generating so much intelligence that they couldn't process it fast enough. They had warehouses full of tape recordings that nobody had time to listen to, filing cabinets stuffed with reports that nobody had time to read, and photographs of people doing absolutely nothing suspicious piled up in boxes that nobody had time to examine. The situation became so absurd that Stasi officers were spending more time filing reports about their surveillance activities than actually conducting surveillance. They had created a bureaucracy so complex and inefficient that it was essentially spying on itself. The real stupidity became apparent when the Berlin Wall fell and researchers gained access to Stasi files. They discovered that the Stasi had detailed files on people whose only crime was existing in East Germany, but they had completely missed actual dissidents and resistance movements that were operating right under their noses. They had thousands of hours of recordings of people complaining about grocery store lines, but they had failed to detect the organized opposition groups that eventually brought down the entire communist government. The Stasi had created the most comprehensive surveillance apparatus in human history, and it was so overwhelmed by trivial information that it couldn't identify actual threats to the state it was supposed to protect. But perhaps the most embarrassing discovery was that many Stasi officers had been filing false reports for years because they couldn't keep up with their surveillance quotas. They were making up conversations, inventing suspicious activities, and creating fictional dissidents just to meet their bureaucratic requirements. So not only was the Stasi collecting too much useless information, much of the information they were collecting was completely fabricated by their own officers. It was like an intelligence service that had become so obsessed with appearing busy that it forgot to actually do intelligence work. The eighth spectacular spy blunder involves the CIA's attempt to use psychic powers for intelligence gathering, because apparently someone in Langley watched too many science fiction movies and decided that telepathy was a legitimate intelligence gathering technique. The program was called Stargate, and it ran from the 1970s through the 1990s, consuming millions of taxpayer dollars while producing absolutely no useful intelligence whatsoever. The basic premise was that certain individuals possessed psychic abilities that could be used to gather information about distant locations or events through something called remote viewing. The CIA recruited people who claimed to have psychic powers and put them through training programs designed to enhance their supposed telepathic abilities. These psychics were then asked to describe military installations they had never seen, locate missing persons they had never met, and predict future events they couldn't possibly know about. The results were about as accurate as you would expect from a program based on supernatural nonsense. But the CIA kept funding it anyway because they were convinced that the Soviets were developing their own psychic spy program, and America couldn't afford to fall behind in the psychic arms race. The program's failures were legendary. Psychics consistently provided information that was either completely wrong or so vague it was useless. They would describe buildings that didn't exist, locate missing persons in places they had never been, and make predictions that never came true. One psychic claimed to have located a crashed Soviet submarine using his telepathic powers, leading to an expensive search operation that found nothing but empty ocean. Another psychic insisted that Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was hiding in a specific building in Tripoli, which turned out to be an elementary school that had been abandoned for years. But the CIA kept the program running because they had invested so much money in it that admitting it was worthless would have been embarrassing. They created elaborate protocols for psychic intelligence gathering, established quality control measures for telepathic information, and even developed training programs for military personnel who wanted to develop their own psychic abilities. It was like a massive government-funded fantasy role-playing game, except the players actually believed they had magical powers and were making national security decisions based on their imaginary, telepathic visions. The program finally ended in the 1990s, when a comprehensive review concluded that remote viewing had never provided any actionable intelligence and was no more accurate than random guessing. 20 years and millions of dollars had been spent trying to turn fortune tellers into intelligence assets, and the only thing the program accomplished was proving that psychic powers don't exist. It's the kind of operation that makes you wonder what other ridiculous ideas are currently being funded by intelligence agencies around the world. The Cold War's shadow loomed large over the intelligence community, creating a pressure cooker environment where even the smallest mistakes could spiral into international incidents. Our journey through espionage disasters continues with tales from this era of paranoia, nuclear brinkmanship, and technological overreach that would make today's intelligence professionals cringe in recognition. The Berlin Tunnel operation, hailed as one of the CIA's greatest Cold War victories, was actually a masterclass in self-deception. In 1955, American and British intelligence spent months digging a sophisticated tunnel beneath East Berlin to tap Soviet communication cables. For nearly a year, they intercepted thousands of hours of conversations, feeling smugly superior about their technological prowess. The devastating truth emerged later. The Soviets knew about the tunnel from day one. George Blake, a British intelligence officer who was secretly working for the KGB, had informed Moscow about the entire operation before the first shovel hit dirt. The Soviets simply fed disinformation through the tapped lines while appearing oblivious. When they finally discovered the tunnel in a dramatic raid complete with press coverage, Western intelligence agencies celebrated their year of supposed success, never realizing they had been expertly manipulated. The operation that was supposed to provide crucial intelligence instead became a Soviet propaganda victory and a testament to how confirmation bias can blind even seasoned spies. The Bay of Pigs invasion stands as perhaps the most spectacular intelligence failure in American history, a perfect storm of wishful thinking, poor planning, and catastrophic miscommunication. The CIA's plan to overthrow Fidel Castro relied on the assumption that the Cuban people would spontaneously rise up to support a small force of exiles landing on a remote beach. This assumption was based on virtually no reliable intelligence about Cuban public opinion. The agency had become so insulated in its anti-Castro bubble that it genuinely believed its own propaganda about widespread discontent. When the invasion force landed at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, they found no popular uprising, no friendly locals, and no easy escape route. Castro's forces quickly surrounded and captured most of the invaders. The promised American air support never materialized due to political concerns, leaving the exile force stranded. The operation's failure wasn't just tactical. It was a fundamental intelligence breakdown that demonstrated how agencies can become victims of their own wishful thinking, mistaking desire for reality and assumption for fact. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed another dimension of intelligence failure: the danger of mirror imaging, where analysts assume foreign leaders will think and act like they would. American intelligence consistently underestimated Soviet willingness to place nuclear missiles in Cuba because it seemed too risky and provocative from an American perspective. When U-2 spy plane photographs finally revealed the missile sites in October 1962, it caught the intelligence community almost completely off guard. The CIA had been monitoring Soviet shipping to Cuba, but had dismissed the possibility of offensive weapons deployment. Even more embarrassingly, some of the crucial intelligence came from a British agent, Oleg Penkovsky, whose warnings about Soviet intentions had been initially downplayed by American analysts who thought he was being overly dramatic. The crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, partly because intelligence agencies on both sides had fundamentally misread each other's intentions and capabilities, proving that even the highest stakes couldn't prevent basic analytical failures. Project MK Ultra represents one of the most ethically bankrupt and scientifically worthless intelligence programs in history. The CIA's mind control experiments, conducted from the 1950s through the 1970s, were based on the scientifically absurd premise that human consciousness could be reprogrammed like a computer. Convinced that the Soviets and Chinese had developed advanced brainwashing techniques, the agency launched a desperate attempt to catch up. The program involved dosing unwitting subjects with LSD, subjecting prisoners to sensory deprivation, and conducting psychological torture experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. The tragic irony is that none of these horrific experiments produced any usable intelligence techniques. The human mind proved far more resilient and complex than the behaviorist theories popular at the time suggested. When congressional investigations finally exposed MKUltra in the 1970s, it became clear that the program had been based on paranoid fantasies rather than scientific evidence. The agency had tortured innocent people, destroyed lives, and wasted enormous resources chasing a chimera that existed only in the fevered imagination of Cold War paranoids. The Cambridge 5 spy ring exposed fundamental weaknesses in British intelligence vetting that persisted for decades. Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross had all been recruited by Soviet intelligence while at Cambridge University in the 1930s, yet they managed to penetrate the highest levels of British intelligence and foreign service. The failure wasn't just about missing their recruitment. It was about the class-based assumptions that made such penetration possible. The British establishment's faith in the loyalty of its own social class created massive blind spots. Philby, in particular, was considered above suspicion precisely because he fit the profile of the ideal intelligence officer: charming, well-connected, and apparently devoted to the cause. His colleagues dismissed mounting evidence of his treachery because they couldn't conceive that someone of his background could be a traitor. When Burgess and Maclean defected to Moscow in 1951, and later when Philby himself fled in 1963, it became clear that Soviet intelligence had been reading British secrets for over 2 decades. The damage was incalculable, but perhaps even more damaging was the revelation that British intelligence had been so easily deceived by its own prejudices and assumptions. The Aldrich Ames case demonstrated how greed and personal problems could compromise even veteran intelligence officers, while also revealing systemic failures in counterintelligence procedures. Ames, a CIA officer with access to Soviet operations, began selling secrets to the KGB in 1985. His motivation was primarily financial. He needed money to support an expensive lifestyle and a new wife's spending habits. Over 9 years, he betrayed virtually every major CIA asset in the Soviet Union, leading to the execution of at least 10 agents. The most damning aspect of the case wasn't just Ames's treachery, but how long it took the CIA to catch him, despite obvious warning signs. He was living far beyond his government salary, displaying wealth that should have triggered immediate investigation. His colleagues noticed his expensive car, lavish home renovations, and costly vacations. But the agency's compartmentalized culture discouraged questioning. When CIA assets in Moscow began disappearing at an alarming rate, the agency initially blamed bad tradecraft and coincidence rather than considering a mole. Ames' eventual capture came more through FBI persistence than CIA competence, highlighting how institutional pride and bureaucratic rivalry could impede counterintelligence efforts. The Iran hostage crisis rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, showcased how poor intelligence coordination could doom even the most carefully planned operations. In April 1980, American Special Forces attempted to rescue 52 hostages held at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. The mission required precise coordination between multiple military branches detailed intelligence about the target location, and flawless execution under extreme conditions. The intelligence failures began with basic reconnaissance. The rescue team had inadequate information about the embassy layout, guard positions, and hostage locations. Weather conditions at the staging area were poorly assessed, contributing to equipment failures. Most critically, the intelligence community failed to provide accurate assessments of Iranian military capabilities and response times. When the mission encountered mechanical problems at the staging area in the Iranian desert, commanders made the fateful decision to abort. During the withdrawal, a helicopter collided with a transport plane, killing 8 servicemen and destroying equipment. The failed mission not only cost lives, but also provided Iran with a propaganda victory and valuable intelligence about American special operations capabilities. The disaster highlighted how even elite military units could be undone by inadequate intelligence preparation. The Able Archer 83 exercise nearly triggered World War III due to a catastrophic intelligence failure on both sides. This NATO military exercise in November 1983 was designed to simulate nuclear warfare, but Soviet intelligence interpreted it as preparation for an actual first strike. The KGB had been told to watch for signs of American attack preparations, and the realistic nature of Able Archer seemed to confirm their worst fears. Soviet forces were placed on high alert, and some nuclear units prepared for immediate launch. The crisis was compounded by the recent shooting down of Korean Airlines Flight 007, which had heightened tensions dramatically. American intelligence, meanwhile, completely failed to recognize how seriously the Soviets were taking the exercise. The US side assumed Moscow understood it was just a drill, never realizing that their simulation was being interpreted as genuine war preparation. Only years later did Western intelligence learn how close the world had come to nuclear war over what was essentially a communication failure. The incident demonstrated how the intelligence communities on both sides had become so trapped in their own assumptions that they nearly stumbled into the very catastrophe they were supposed to prevent. The farewell dossier operation showed how even successful intelligence coups could backfire spectacularly due to overconfidence and poor risk assessment. In the early 1980s, French intelligence provided the CIA with documents from a Soviet KGB officer codenamed Farewell, revealing the extent of Soviet technology theft from the West. Rather than simply using this intelligence defensively, the CIA decided to feed the Soviets sabotage technology. Computer chips were programmed to fail, software contained hidden flaws, and equipment was designed to malfunction at critical moments. The most dramatic success was sabotaging software controlling a Siberian gas pipeline, causing a massive explosion visible from space. However, the operation's very success created new problems. The Soviets eventually realized they were being fed defective technology, leading them to become even more suspicious and paranoid about Western goods. More problematically, the sabotage campaign required the CIA to develop sophisticated methods for corrupting technology, capabilities that raise serious questions about American intentions among allies. When details of the operation eventually leaked, it damaged relationships with technology companies and raised concerns about the weaponization of commercial products. What began as a clever way to turn Soviet espionage against itself evolved into a program that complicated American foreign relations and technological diplomacy for years. The intelligence failures surrounding the fall of the Berlin Wall epitomized how even the most sophisticated intelligence agencies could be blindsided by rapid political change. Despite having extensive human and technical intelligence resources focused on East Germany, Western intelligence agencies failed to predict or even recognize the signs of impending collapse. The CIA, with its emphasis on military and nuclear threats, had largely ignored the economic and social pressures building within the Soviet bloc. When East German citizens began fleeing through Hungary in 1989, intelligence analysts initially dismissed it as a temporary problem rather than a sign of systemic failure. Even as the East German government began losing control, American intelligence estimates continued to suggest the communist regime would survive. The actual fall of the wall on November 9, 1989, caught intelligence agencies completely off guard. They had been so focused on traditional security threats that they missed the power of popular movements and economic collapse. The failure wasn't just analytical, it was conceptual. Intelligence agencies had become so invested in the idea of a stable, bipolar world that they couldn't recognize the signs of its dissolution, even when those signs were literally dancing on the Berlin Wall. These Cold War intelligence disasters reveal recurring patterns that continue to plague espionage operations today. The tendency toward confirmation bias, where agencies seek information that confirms their existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence, runs through virtually every major failure. The compartmentalized nature of intelligence work, designed to protect secrets, often prevents the kind of cross-pollination of ideas that might catch critical mistakes. Perhaps most importantly, these failures demonstrate how intelligence agencies can become prisoners of their own assumptions, creating elaborate analytical frameworks that blind them to simple truths. The Bay of Pigs planners couldn't imagine that Cubans might support Castro. The Cambridge Five's colleagues couldn't conceive that gentlemen could be traitors. The able Archer analysts couldn't believe the Soviets would mistake an exercise for reality. In each case, the failure wasn't technical, but imaginative. An inability to step outside established patterns of thinking and consider alternative possibilities. These disasters serve as enduring reminders that intelligence work, for all its technological sophistication and analytical rigor, remains fundamentally vulnerable to the most basic human failings of pride, assumption, and the dangerous comfort of conventional wisdom. Building on our exploration of espionage disasters, we now venture into the murky world of intelligence operations that went spectacularly wrong due to human error, technological mishaps, and sheer incompetence. These next blunders demonstrate how even the most sophisticated spy agencies can stumble when overconfidence meets reality. The Watergate burglary of 1972 stands as perhaps America's most famous intelligence blunder, not because it was particularly complex, but because it was so breathtakingly amateurish. 5 men, connected to President Nixon's re-election campaign, attempted to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Their mission was simple: plant listening devices and photograph documents. Instead, they managed to get caught by a security guard who noticed tape over door locks. The burglars were carrying sequentially numbered $100 bills, address books with White House phone numbers, and sophisticated surveillance equipment that screamed professional operation. Yet they failed at the most basic requirement of any covert mission: not getting caught. The subsequent cover-up attempts only made things worse, ultimately bringing down a presidency. It was a masterclass in how a simple black bag job can spiral into a constitutional crisis when executed with stunning incompetence. The Cambridge Five represented one of the most damaging spy rings in British history, but their success was matched only by the spectacular failure of British counterintelligence to detect them for decades. Kim Philby, Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross had been recruited by Soviet intelligence while at Cambridge University in the 1930s. The blunder wasn't their recruitment, it was how British intelligence continued to trust and promote them despite mounting evidence of their treachery. Philby actually rose to become head of Soviet counterintelligence for MI6, essentially allowing the fox to guard the henhouse. When suspicions finally arose, the British response was equally bungled. They warned Maclean he was under investigation, allowing him to flee to Moscow. Burgess, who wasn't even under suspicion, panicked and fled with him, immediately implicating himself. The British establishment then spent years protecting Blunt, the Queen's art curator, even after his confession. It was a decades-long failure of vetting, supervision, and damage control that compromised countless operations and agents. Project Jennifer, the CIA's attempt to raise a sunken Soviet submarine from the Pacific Ocean floor in 1974, seemed like an impossible mission that somehow succeeded. Except it didn't really succeed at all. The Glomar Explorer, a specially built deep-sea mining vessel, managed to locate and partially raise the K-129 submarine that had sunk in 1968. The operation was a marvel of engineering and secrecy, costing over $800 million in today's money. The blunder was that they only managed to recover a small section of the submarine, missing the most valuable parts containing nuclear missiles and codebooks. Even worse, the section they did recover broke apart during the lifting process, sending most of it back to the ocean floor. The CIA then had to maintain an elaborate cover story about deep-sea mining while dealing with the exposure of the operation by investigative journalists. They spent enormous resources to recover what amounted to a few Soviet torpedoes and the remains of some sailors who they buried at sea with full military honors in a touching but strategically pointless ceremony. The Aldrich Ames case demonstrated how the CIA's own internal security was laughably inadequate when it came to detecting a mole in their midst. Ames, a CIA counterintelligence officer, began selling secrets to the Soviets in 1985, ultimately compromising virtually every CIA asset in the Soviet Union. At least 10 agents were executed as a direct result of his betrayal. The blunder wasn't just that Ames was a traitor, it was how obvious he made it and how long it took the CIA to notice. He suddenly began living far beyond his means, buying a house for cash, driving expensive cars, and taking lavish vacations, all on a government salary. When questioned about his newfound wealth, he claimed it came from his wife's family, a story that should have taken minutes to verify but apparently never was. The CIA's counterintelligence division was so focused on finding Soviet moles that they overlooked the one selling them out from within their own ranks. It took nearly 9 years to catch him, during which time he continued to betray operations and agents with impunity. The FBI's COINTELPRO program, while achieving some of its dubious objectives, became a massive blunder when its existence was exposed by a group of anti-war activists who burglarized an FBI office in Pennsylvania in 1971. The program involved surveillance, infiltration, discrediting, and disrupting domestic political organizations that the FBI deemed subversive. The blunder was that the FBI kept detailed written records of illegal activities that should never have been documented. When the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into the Media, Pennsylvania office, they found filing cabinets full of evidence showing systematic violations of civil liberties. The FBI's response was even more bungled, launching a massive investigation called OMEDBURG that involved 200 agents, but failed to identify any of the burglars. The exposure of COINTELPRO led to congressional investigations, new oversight mechanisms, and lasting damage to the FBI's reputation. It was a perfect example of how meticulous record-keeping, normally a virtue in intelligence work, can become a devastating liability when those records document criminal activity. The Venona project, while ultimately successful in decrypting Soviet communications, suffered from a massive intelligence blunder in its early years. The project began in 1943, when the US Army began collecting encrypted Soviet diplomatic cables. However, it took cryptographers several years to realize they could break some of the codes because the Soviets had reused one-time pads, violating the basic principle that made the encryption theoretically unbreakable. The blunder was that American intelligence initially focused on the wrong target, assuming they should be reading German communications rather than those of their Soviet allies. When they finally began making progress on Soviet codes, they discovered evidence of extensive Soviet espionage in the United States, including the atomic spy rings. However, the information was so highly classified that it couldn't be used in court, meaning they could identify Soviet spies but couldn't prosecute them. This led to the frustrating situation where agencies knew who the traitors were, but had to find other ways to neutralize them, sometimes leading to more public disasters like the Rosenberg case. The Church Committee investigations of the 1970s revealed that the CIA had engaged in numerous illegal domestic surveillance activities, violating its charter, which prohibited operations within the United States. The program, known as Operation Chaos, monitored American citizens and organizations opposed to the Vietnam War. The blunder wasn't just that they were breaking the law, it was how extensively they documented their law-breaking. The CIA maintained detailed files on over 13,000 American citizens and organizations, creating a paper trail that would later prove devastating when exposed. Even worse, much of the surveillance was completely pointless from an intelligence perspective, focusing on anti-war activists who posed no genuine threat to national security. When director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of many Chaos files in 1973, it only made the scandal worse by adding obstruction of justice to the list of violations. The exposure of Operation Chaos contributed to new restrictions on intelligence activities and demonstrated how mission creep can lead agencies to betray their fundamental purpose. The Robert Hanssen case represents one of the most damaging intelligence failures in FBI history, made worse by the fact that Hanssen was a counterintelligence specialist, supposedly expert at catching spies. Beginning in 1979, Hanssen sold classified information to Soviet and later Russian intelligence services for over 20 years. His betrayals led to the execution of several US agents and compromised numerous operations. The blunder was multifaceted. First, the FBI's internal security was so lax that Hanssen could access and steal classified information with impunity. Second, when the FBI finally realized they had a mole, they initially suspected the wrong person, CIA officer Brian Kelly, subjecting him to intensive surveillance while the real traitor continued his activities. Third, Hanssen's behavior should have raised red flags years earlier, including his obsession with pornography, his financial irregularities, and his strange relationship with a stripper to whom he gave classified information. The FBI was so focused on external threats that they failed to properly monitor their own personnel, allowing one of the most damaging spies in American history to operate undetected for 2 decades. The intelligence failure surrounding the 9/11 attacks wasn't due to lack of information, but rather the catastrophic failure to connect available dots and share intelligence between agencies. The CIA knew that known al-Qaeda operatives were in the United States. The FBI had reports about suspicious flight training activities, and various agencies had pieces of information that, when combined, painted a clear picture of the impending attack. The blunder was the bureaucratic dysfunction that prevented this information from being properly analyzed and acted upon. The CIA failed to inform the FBI that known terrorists were in the country. Different FBI field offices didn't communicate with each other, and the intelligence community's focus on foreign threats left them blind to domestic preparations for the attack. Even more embarrassing, the terrorists made little effort to hide their activities, using their real names to take flying lessons and purchase airline tickets. The failure wasn't in collection, but in analysis and coordination, demonstrating how organizational incompetence can negate even the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering capabilities. The Iran-Contra affair demonstrated how covert operations can spiral completely out of control when proper oversight is abandoned. The Reagan administration's attempt to secretly fund Nicaraguan Contra rebels by selling arms to Iran violated multiple laws and congressional directives. The blunder began with the flawed premise that selling weapons to Iranian moderates could secure the release of American hostages while funding the Contras. In reality, there were no Iranian moderates with real influence. The weapons sales only encouraged more hostage-taking, and the entire operation violated the administration's own stated policy of not negotiating with terrorists. When the operation was exposed, the cover-up attempts made everything worse. Officials shredded documents, lied to Congress, and created elaborate stories that quickly unraveled under investigation. The scandal damaged American credibility internationally and demonstrated how covert operations conducted without proper legal framework inevitably become political disasters. The Wen-Ho Lee case showed how espionage investigations can be botched through racial profiling, sloppy analysis, and prosecutorial overreach. When the FBI discovered that nuclear secrets had been leaked to China, they focused on Lee, a Taiwanese-American scientist at Los Alamos, largely because of his ethnicity and the fact that he had downloaded classified files to his personal computer. The investigation was a masterclass in confirmation bias, with agents interpreting innocent actions as evidence of espionage. Lee was held in solitary confinement for 9 months, accused of being one of the most dangerous spies in American history. However, the case collapsed when it became clear that the FBI had no evidence of actual espionage, that Lee's downloading of files was related to legitimate work concerns, and that the investigation had been driven more by prejudice than evidence. The judge apologized to Lee for his treatment, and the government eventually paid him $1.6 million in damages. The case became a symbol of how intelligence investigations can go wrong when assumptions replace evidence and racial profiling substitutes for actual counterintelligence work. These intelligence blunders share common themes: overconfidence leading to inadequate security measures, bureaucratic dysfunction preventing effective coordination, and the human tendency to see what we expect to see rather than what's actually there. They remind us that even the most sophisticated intelligence operations are ultimately dependent on fallible human judgment, and that the very secrecy that protects intelligence work can also shield incompetence from proper scrutiny. The most dangerous intelligence failures often occur not from external penetration, but from internal dysfunction and the systematic breakdown of the checks and balances that should prevent catastrophic errors. Moving deeper into our catalogue of espionage catastrophes, we encounter failures that reveal how even the most sophisticated intelligence operations can crumble under the weight of human error, technological limitations, and sheer overconfidence. These next blunders showcase a different dimension of intelligence failure, where success itself becomes the enemy of future operations. The Venona project represents one of the most fascinating paradoxes in intelligence history. This top-secret American program successfully decrypted thousands of Soviet intelligence messages from the 1940s, revealing the extent of Soviet espionage in the United States. The breakthrough came when Soviet cryptographers made a critical error by reusing one-time pad keys, supposedly the most secure encryption method available. However, the intelligence community's handling of this goldmine of information created its own set of problems. The project remained so classified that even Presidents Truman and Eisenhower weren't fully briefed on its findings. This excessive secrecy meant that crucial intelligence about Soviet spies couldn't be used in prosecutions or counterintelligence operations without revealing the source. The result was watching known Soviet agents operate freely while being unable to act decisively against them. It's the ultimate intelligence catch-22, where having perfect information becomes useless because using it would compromise the source. The Ghost Army of World War II showcases how deception operations can succeed brilliantly yet fail catastrophically through poor coordination. This classified unit used inflatable tanks, fake radio transmissions, and sound effects to convince German forces they were facing massive Allied divisions where only small units actually existed. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops pulled off some of the war's most creative deceptions, including making the Germans believe Patton's army was preparing to invade at Calais rather than Normandy. Their success rate was remarkable, consistently fooling enemy reconnaissance. The failure came in communication breakdowns with regular Allied forces who weren't informed about these deception operations. Multiple incidents occurred where real Allied units stumbled into areas where Ghost Army operations were creating fake enemy positions, leading to friendly fire incidents and tactical confusion. In one notorious case, an Allied artillery unit spent hours shelling what they believed was a German position, only to discover they'd been attacking inflatable decoys, while real enemy forces maneuvered unopposed nearby. The Ghost Army's creativity couldn't overcome the fundamental intelligence failure of not coordinating deception with actual military operations. Operation Mincemeat demonstrates how even successful deception operations can create unexpected intelligence vulnerabilities. The British plan to plant false invasion plans on a corpse and float it to Spanish shores worked perfectly, convincing the Germans that the Allies would invade Greece rather than Sicily. The Germans fell for the deception completely, redeploying forces based on the fake documents. However, the operation's success created a dangerous precedent that German intelligence began to exploit. They started their own corpse-based deception operations, and more problematically, they began questioning the authenticity of all documents that seemed too convenient. This led to a period where genuine intelligence documents were dismissed as potential deceptions, creating a hall of mirrors effect where both sides became paralyzed by overthinking. The British had been so clever that they made the Germans clever too, ultimately reducing the effectiveness of future deception operations. It's a perfect example of how winning one intelligence battle can lose the intelligence war. The Acoustic Kitty project reveals the absurd lengths intelligence agencies will go to in pursuit of surveillance capabilities. The CIA spent millions of dollars in the 1960s attempting to turn cats into walking listening devices by surgically implanting microphones, transmitters, and antennas. The theory was that cats could naturally approach targets without arousing suspicion, providing perfect cover for surveillance operations. The first field test was supposed to target Soviet officials meeting in a Washington park. The specially modified cat was released from a van across the street, intended to casually wander over and position itself near the targets. Instead, the cat immediately ran into traffic and was killed by a taxi, along with millions of dollars worth of cutting-edge surveillance equipment. The project continued for several more years with similar results, cats proving remarkably uninterested in following CIA directives, regardless of how much technology was crammed into their bodies. The program was eventually terminated when someone finally acknowledged that cats, unlike human agents, cannot be trained to ignore their natural instincts in favor of mission objectives. The Farewell dossier represents one of the most sophisticated long-term deception operations ever attempted, yet its very success contained the seeds of its failure. In the 1980s, French intelligence provided the CIA with information about a Soviet technology theft operation called Line X. Rather than simply shutting down the spy ring, the CIA decided to feed the Soviets defective technology, including software with hidden logic bombs and flawed manufacturing specifications. The operation worked brilliantly for years, causing explosions in Soviet pipelines, failures in military equipment, and setbacks in their space program. However, the success of the operation created an unexpected problem. It made Soviet engineers increasingly paranoid about Western technology. They began developing indigenous alternatives and implementing extensive testing procedures that actually improved their technological capabilities in some areas. More problematically, when the Soviets eventually discovered the deception, they began assuming all Western technology contained hidden flaws, leading them to reverse engineer and improve upon designs they might have otherwise simply copied. The CIA's clever sabotage operation inadvertently spurred Soviet technological innovation. The Able Archer 83 exercise illustrates how intelligence simulations can become indistinguishable from actual operations, creating genuine international crises. This NATO command post exercise was designed to test nuclear release procedures and included realistic protocols for escalating to nuclear conflict. However, the exercise was so realistic that Soviet intelligence couldn't determine whether it was a drill or preparation for an actual first strike. The simulation included genuine political leaders, authentic communication procedures, and realistic timing that coincided with actual NATO military deployments. Soviet forces were placed on high alert, and some historians believe the world came closer to nuclear war during this exercise than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The intelligence failure was multifaceted. NATO intelligence underestimated how realistic the exercise would appear to Soviet observers, while Soviet intelligence couldn't penetrate NATO communications well enough to distinguish between simulation and preparation for war. The exercise succeeded too well at simulating nuclear conflict preparation, creating the very crisis it was designed to help prevent. Project Chaos demonstrates how domestic surveillance operations can spiral beyond their original scope, ultimately compromising their effectiveness through sheer scale. Initially designed to investigate foreign influence on anti-war protesters, the CIA operation eventually expanded to monitor hundreds of thousands of American citizens with no connection to foreign intelligence. The program collected massive files on politicians, journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens, based on increasingly tenuous connections to the original mission. The failure wasn't just ethical, but operational. The vast amount of irrelevant information made it impossible to identify actual foreign intelligence operations. Analysts were drowning in reports about college students attending protests while missing genuine Soviet intelligence activities. The program became so broad that it was simultaneously violating its charter by spying on Americans and failing in its mission to detect foreign espionage, because the signal was lost in the noise of domestic surveillance. When congressional investigations finally exposed chaos, the revelations damaged CIA credibility and led to restrictions that actually hampered legitimate foreign intelligence operations. The Walker spy ring reveals how human intelligence networks can operate successfully for decades while creating vulnerabilities that ultimately expose them. John Walker, a U.S. Navy communications specialist, provided the Soviet Union with cryptographic keys and classified naval information for 18 years, potentially compromising every U.S. Navy operation during that period. The ring expanded to include Walker's brother, son, and friend, creating a family business of espionage that Soviet handlers managed carefully to avoid detection. The operation was a masterpiece of human intelligence, providing the Soviets with unprecedented access to American military communications. However, the very success of the operation created the conditions for its failure. Walker's alcoholism, financial recklessness, and increasingly erratic behavior gradually made him a security risk. More critically, his decision to recruit family members created emotional complications that professional spies are trained to avoid. The ring was finally exposed when Walker's ex-wife, motivated by personal revenge rather than patriotism, contacted the FBI. The Soviets had run a perfect intelligence operation for nearly 2 decades, only to see it destroyed by domestic drama they couldn't control. These failures reveal a consistent pattern in intelligence operations. Success often contains the seeds of future failure. Whether through overconfidence, unintended consequences, or the simple fact that perfection in one area often creates vulnerabilities in others, even the most sophisticated intelligence operations remain vulnerable to the fundamental unpredictability of human nature and the complex systems they attempt to manipulate. Now let's dive into the fifth wave of espionage catastrophes, where overconfidence and technological hubris created some of the most spectacular intelligence failures in history. These blunders prove that even the most sophisticated operations can crumble when human nature meets Murphy's Law. Our 15th disaster takes us to the shadowy world of Cold War deception operations. The CIA's Project Mockingbird aimed to influence global media narratives, but the agency's handlers became so enamored with their own propaganda that they began believing their fabricated stories. Intelligence analysts started using their own planted news articles as legitimate sources, creating a dangerous feedback loop of misinformation. When Soviet agents discovered this circular reporting system, they began feeding false information into American media outlets, knowing it would eventually reach CIA desks as supposedly independent confirmation. The result was a hall of mirrors where intelligence professionals couldn't distinguish between their own lies and genuine intelligence, leading to catastrophically wrong assessments about Soviet capabilities and intentions. The 16th blunder involves the spectacular failure of the British intelligence service's Operation Valuable in Albania during the late 1940s. The plan was to infiltrate Albanian agents to overthrow the communist government, but the operation was doomed from the start by a combination of bureaucratic incompetence and the presence of Kim Philby, the Soviet double agent, in the planning committee. However, even without Philby's betrayal, the operation would have failed spectacularly. British planners chose to drop agents wearing Western clothes and carrying obviously foreign equipment into a country where such items were virtually impossible to obtain. The agents were instructed to blend in while carrying radios that were completely different from any local models, wearing shoes that no Albanian could afford, and speaking with accents that immediately marked them as foreigners. Most were captured within hours of landing, not because of sophisticated counterintelligence, but because they stood out like neon signs in a medieval village. The 17th failure showcases the dangers of technological over-reliance in intelligence gathering. During the 1960s, the CIA developed an elaborate system of electronic surveillance in Vietnam, planting thousands of acoustic sensors to monitor enemy troop movements. The system, called Operation Igloo White, was supposed to provide real-time intelligence about North Vietnamese activities along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. However, the North Vietnamese quickly discovered the sensors and began an elaborate deception campaign. They tied the sensors to water buffalo, played recordings of truck engines near the devices, and even organized fake radio chatter to mislead American analysts. The CIA spent years analyzing the movement patterns of livestock, while real enemy convoys passed undetected. The operation consumed enormous resources and provided intelligence that was not just useless, but actively harmful, as it led to bombing campaigns against empty jungle, while actual supply routes remained untouched. Our 18th disaster demonstrates how bureaucratic rivalry can destroy even the most promising intelligence operations. The FBI and CIA's joint investigation into Soviet activities in the United States during the 1970s collapsed into a turf war that made the Keystone Cops look professional. Both agencies were tracking the same Soviet operatives, but refused to share information, leading to a comedy of errors where FBI agents would inadvertently surveil CIA officers who were watching the same targets. The situation reached peak absurdity when FBI surveillance teams began following CIA operatives, believing they were Soviet agents, while CIA officers started investigating FBI personnel they suspected of being double agents. The real Soviet spies, meanwhile, easily identified the competing surveillance teams and began deliberately leading them in circles. One Soviet operative later revealed that he had figured out the entire mess within weeks and had been deliberately scheduling meetings to maximize the chaos between the competing American teams. The 19th blunder takes us to the world of diplomatic intelligence, where the State Department's overconfidence in its cultural understanding led to a series of embarrassing failures. In the 1980s, American diplomats in Moscow became convinced they had developed a foolproof system for detecting Soviet surveillance by analyzing the behavior patterns of pedestrians and drivers. They created elaborate protocols for identifying KGB operatives based on clothing choices, walking patterns, and even the way people held newspapers. The system was so detailed that diplomats carried laminated cards with surveillance detection techniques. However, the entire system was based on American assumptions about what constituted suspicious behavior. Soviet surveillance teams, aware of these American preconceptions, began deliberately exhibiting the exact opposite behaviors. KGB operatives would dress in bright colors, walk in obviously casual manners, and carry Western magazines, while ordinary Soviet citizens going about their daily business were constantly flagged as potential surveillance. The result was a diplomatic corps that was perpetually paranoid about innocent civilians while remaining completely oblivious to actual intelligence operations. The 20th failure involves one of the most expensive intelligence-gathering mistakes in history. The Defense Intelligence Agency's Project Stargate attempted to use psychic phenomena for espionage purposes, spending over $20 million on remote viewing experiments. While the project's existence was classified, the operational security was laughably inadequate. Psychics were given detailed briefings about their targets before attempting to remotely view them, making it impossible to determine whether any accurate information came from paranormal abilities or simply from the briefings themselves. More embarrassingly, several of the psychics were actually Soviet agents who had infiltrated the program. The KGB received detailed information about American intelligence priorities and methods, while the Americans received elaborate fabrications about Soviet military installations. The project's final report claimed numerous successes, but subsequent investigation revealed that most of the psychic intelligence was actually information the subjects could have obtained from public sources or had been inadvertently provided during the briefing process. Our 21st disaster demonstrates how technological advancement can create new vulnerabilities. The NSA's development of advanced computer systems in the 1970s was supposed to revolutionize intelligence analysis, but the agency's programmers made a critical error in the system's design. The computers were programmed to flag unusual communication patterns, but the algorithms were based on American communication habits. When applied to intercepted Soviet communications, the system consistently identified normal Russian conversational patterns as suspicious while missing actual coded messages that followed different linguistic structures. The situation became even worse when Soviet intelligence discovered the system's existence and began deliberately mimicking American communication patterns in their actual intelligence traffic. The NSA spent years analyzing routine bureaucratic communications, while coded intelligence flowed through their systems undetected. The 22nd blunder involves the spectacular failure of a joint CIA-British intelligence operation in Eastern Europe. The operation, designed to establish a network of informants behind the Iron Curtain, was compromised from the beginning by a fundamental misunderstanding of local culture. Western intelligence officers assumed that the best way to recruit informants was to offer them Western consumer goods and money. However, in the target countries, possessing such items was extremely dangerous and immediately suspicious. Potential informants were being offered rewards that would essentially mark them for arrest. The operation's security was further compromised when intelligence officers insisted on using American-made equipment that was completely unknown in the region. Radio transmitters, cameras, and even pens were obviously foreign-made and would immediately identify anyone carrying them as connected to Western intelligence. The final nail in the operation's coffin was the decision to use a code system based on American baseball terminology in countries where the sport was completely unknown. The 23rd failure showcases the dangers of overcomplicating simple operations. The CIA's attempt to monitor Soviet naval activities in the 1970s involved an elaborate plan to place listening devices on the ocean floor near Soviet submarine bases. The operation required specialized submarines, custom-built equipment, and months of planning. However, the devices were designed to be retrieved by submarine crews, who would need to locate them in the dark depths of the ocean. The retrieval system was so complex that it required perfect weather conditions, precise navigation, and equipment that functioned flawlessly in extreme conditions. When the first retrieval mission was attempted, the submarine crew discovered that the listening devices had been designed with American electrical standards and were completely incompatible with the submarine's power systems. The devices had been recording for months, but the recordings were stored on a format that couldn't be played on any equipment available on the submarine. The crew was forced to return to base with expensive intelligence equipment they couldn't use, while the listening devices remained on the ocean floor, gradually running out of power. Our 24th disaster involves the collapse of an entire intelligence network due to poor password security. In the 1980s, the CIA established a communication system for its agents in Eastern Europe that used a sophisticated encryption system. However, the system required agents to use passwords that were supposedly impossible to crack. The passwords were based on American cultural references that were completely foreign to the agents who had to use them. Agents were expected to memorize complex combinations that referenced American television shows, sports figures, and cultural events they had never heard of. The system was so difficult to use that agents began writing down the passwords, completely defeating the purpose of the security measures. When the network was eventually compromised, investigators discovered that most agents had been keeping written records of their passwords, often in locations where they could be easily discovered. The sophisticated encryption system had been rendered useless by the simple human need to remember complex information. The 25th blunder demonstrates how intelligence agencies can become victims of their own success. The FBI's COINTELPRO operations were so effective at infiltrating various political groups that the Bureau lost track of which informants were working for which side. The program had recruited so many double agents, triple agents, and unwitting informants that FBI handlers began receiving conflicting reports about the same events from multiple sources. The situation became so confused that FBI agents were investigating their own operations without realizing it. In one particularly embarrassing incident, 2 FBI informants in the same organization began reporting on each other, each convinced that the other was a dangerous radical. The FBI spent months analyzing reports about a supposed security threat that was actually just 2 of their own agents suspicious of each other. The operation consumed enormous resources and provided no useful intelligence, while creating an atmosphere of paranoia that ultimately destroyed the effectiveness of the entire program. The 26th failure involves the spectacular collapse of a CIA operation in Latin America due to cultural misunderstanding. The agency's operatives were tasked with establishing contact with local resistance groups, but their approach was based on American assumptions about how such organizations operated. CIA officers expected to find hierarchical structures with clear chains of command and formal membership procedures. Instead, they encountered loose networks of individuals connected by family relationships, personal friendships, and shared experiences. The Americans' insistence on formal procedures and written agreements immediately marked them as outsiders and potential security threats. The situation was made worse by the operatives' inability to understand local customs and social dynamics. They consistently violated unspoken rules about appropriate behavior, dress, and communication styles. Local contacts began avoiding the Americans, not because they were opposed to the operation's goals, but because association with such obviously foreign agents had become dangerous. Our 27th disaster showcases the dangers of technological dependence in intelligence operations. The NSA's development of automated analysis systems was supposed to reduce the workload on human analysts, but the systems were programmed with assumptions that proved to be completely wrong. The computers were designed to identify patterns in communication traffic that indicated intelligence activity, but the pattern recognition algorithms were based on American communication habits. When applied to intercepted foreign communications, the systems consistently produced false positives while missing actual intelligence traffic. The situation became even worse when foreign intelligence services discovered the existence of these systems and began deliberately creating false patterns to mislead American analysts. The NSA found itself drowning in computer-generated reports about non-existent threats while real intelligence activities went undetected. The 28th blunder involves the failure of a joint international intelligence operation that collapsed due to incompatible security procedures. Multiple intelligence agencies were attempting to coordinate their activities against a common target, but each agency had different security protocols that made cooperation nearly impossible. Information that was classified at one level by one agency was considered unclassified by another, while data that was freely shared by one service was considered highly sensitive by their partners. The operations communications became so complicated that participating agencies began creating their own separate channels, effectively destroying the coordination that was the operation's entire purpose. The target organization easily identified the competing intelligence efforts and began playing the different agencies against each other, feeding each group different information and watching them waste resources, investigating each other rather than focusing on the actual target. The 29th failure demonstrates how intelligence operations can be destroyed by bureaucratic inflexibility. A promising CIA operation in the Middle East was making significant progress in developing high-level sources when headquarters decided to implement new security procedures. The new protocols required all agent communications to be processed through a central facility in the United States, adding days or weeks to response times. Local operatives were forbidden from making any decisions without prior approval from Washington, even for routine operational matters. The rigid new procedures completely destroyed the personal relationships that were the foundation of the operation's success. Sources who had been accustomed to immediate responses and flexible arrangements found themselves dealing with an impersonal bureaucracy that couldn't adapt to local conditions. The operation's effectiveness evaporated as sources lost confidence in their American contacts and began seeking alternative arrangements. The 30th disaster involves the spectacular failure of an operation that was compromised by the intelligence community's own success in developing new technologies. The CIA had developed sophisticated surveillance equipment that was far superior to anything previously available, but the agency's security procedures hadn't been updated to account for the new capabilities. The equipment was so advanced that it could detect surveillance activities that would have been impossible to identify with older technology. However, the CIA's own operatives were still using security procedures designed for an earlier era of intelligence gathering. The result was that the agency's own surveillance activities were being detected by their own equipment, creating a confusing situation where analysts were identifying CIA operations as potential security threats. The problem was compounded by the fact that the new technology was so classified that most of the analysts using it didn't understand its full capabilities or limitations. Our 31st blunder showcases the dangers of overconfidence in human intelligence operations. The Defense Intelligence Agency's recruitment of a high-level source in a foreign military organization seemed like a major intelligence coup. But the source was actually a sophisticated double agent who had been carefully prepared for the role over several years. The false intelligence provided by this source was so skillfully crafted that it confirmed American preconceptions about foreign military capabilities while gradually leading analysts to completely wrong conclusions. The deception was so successful that American military planners began making strategic decisions based on the false intelligence, potentially compromising national security. The double agent's handler was so confident in the source's reliability that they stopped conducting the usual verification procedures, allowing the deception to continue for years before it was finally discovered. The 30-second failure involves the collapse of an entire intelligence operation due to a simple translation error. The CIA's analysis of intercepted communications was based on translations that contained a critical mistake in understanding the target language's cultural context. A phrase that seemed to indicate aggressive military planning was actually a common expression used in completely different contexts. The mistranslation error. Script generation exceeded the maximum token limit. You may need to decrease the amount of reference videos in your style and try again. The true disaster began when British intelligence decided to run a double-agent operation during World War II, but forgot the most basic rule of espionage. Keep track of who's actually working for whom. Agent Zigzag, also known as Eddie Chapman, was a British criminal turned German spy turned British double agent. Sounds complicated? It gets worse. Chapman was so charming and convincing that he managed to confuse not just the Germans, but also his own British handlers. Multiple departments within British intelligence were running him simultaneously, none aware of what the others were doing. The result was Chapman receiving contradictory orders, conflicting missions, and at one point, nearly being arrested by his own side. The operation became such a tangled mess that intelligence officers spent more time trying to figure out what Chapman was supposed to be doing than actually gathering useful intelligence. It was like watching a spy novel written by someone having a nervous breakdown. The Cold War brought us many technological marvels, but also some spectacularly misguided propaganda efforts. Take Operation Outpost, the CIA's brilliant plan to drop thousands of balloons carrying propaganda leaflets into Eastern Europe. The theory was simple. Balloons float over the Iron Curtain, drop leaflets, hearts and minds are one. Communism crumbles. Reality had other plans. The balloons, launched from West Germany, were supposed to release their payload over target countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland. Instead, they ended up scattered across the European countryside like the world's most expensive litter campaign. Some balloons crashed in neutral countries, creating diplomatic incidents. Others landed in NATO countries, confusing farmers who couldn't read the anti-communist messages written in languages they didn't understand. The most embarrassing incident occurred when a balloon intended for Prague landed in a West German cemetery, dropping propaganda leaflets on a funeral service. The operation cost millions and achieved virtually nothing, except proving that weather patterns don't respect geopolitical boundaries. Even when technology worked perfectly, human stupidity found a way to sabotage the most sophisticated espionage operations. The Soviet Union developed incredibly advanced listening devices during the 1960s, including bugs so small they could be hidden in everyday objects. One particular device was a masterpiece of miniaturization, designed to be concealed inside a gift that would sit prominently in the target's office. The bug was planted inside a beautifully carved wooden replica of the Great Seal of the United States, presented to the American ambassador in Moscow as a gesture of friendship from Soviet schoolchildren. For 6 years, this device transmitted conversations from the ambassador's office directly to Soviet intelligence. It was only discovered by accident when a British radio operator noticed strange interference patterns. The device was so advanced, it didn't even need batteries, powered instead by radio waves from a nearby Soviet transmitter. The Americans were mortified to discover they'd been broadcasting their secrets for years, but the Soviets were equally embarrassed when the story went public, because it revealed just how paranoid and duplicitous their friendship gestures really were. Sometimes the most sophisticated intelligence operations collapsed not because of enemy action, but because of internal chaos that would have been hilarious if it weren't so dangerous. During the 1970s, the CIA launched a comprehensive disinformation campaign designed to discredit Soviet influence in Africa. The operation involved planting false stories in newspapers, spreading rumors through diplomatic channels, and even staging fake events to make Soviet advisors look incompetent. The problem was that different CIA departments were running separate disinformation campaigns without coordinating with each other. One department would plant a story claiming Soviet advisors were corrupt, while another would spread rumors that the same advisors were dangerously competent. The contradictory messages confused everyone, including CIA analysts who began writing reports based on their own agency's false information. Some analysts spent months investigating Soviet activities that never actually happened, while others dismissed real Soviet operations as probable CIA disinformation. The campaign became so tangled that a special task force had to be created just to figure out which stories were real and which were invented. By the end, intelligence officers were filing reports debunking their own false intelligence, creating a feedback loop of confusion that lasted for years. The recruitment and training of spies has always been a delicate balance between secrecy and competence, but sometimes agencies got that balance spectacularly wrong. In the early 1960s, French intelligence decided to recruit agents from among university students, believing that intellectuals would make natural spies. They were particularly interested in philosophy and literature students, thinking their analytical minds would be perfect for espionage work. What they got instead was a group of would-be agents who spent more time debating the ethical implications of spying than actually gathering intelligence. One recruit became so paralyzed by the moral complexity of his assignment that he wrote a 50-page philosophical treatise on the nature of betrayal instead of completing his mission. Another spent weeks analyzing the symbolism in his code names before realizing he was supposed to be using them to communicate with his handlers. The program's low point came when a recruit attending a training session on surveillance techniques got into a heated argument with his instructor about whether observation inherently changes the nature of reality. The session devolved into an impromptu philosophy seminar that lasted 3 hours and covered everything from Heisenberg's uncertainty principle to French existentialism, but nothing about actually following people without being noticed. Even successful espionage operations could be undermined by the most mundane bureaucratic failures. The Soviet atomic espionage program of the 1940s was one of the most successful intelligence operations in history, providing Stalin with detailed information about the Manhattan Project. Klaus Fuchs, David Greenglass, and other agents fed a steady stream of nuclear secrets to Moscow, significantly accelerating Soviet atomic weapons development. But the operation nearly collapsed because of a filing error in the KGB's accounting department. The agent responsible for processing expense reports kept confusing the code names of different operatives, resulting in payments being sent to the wrong people. One atomic spy received money intended for an agent gathering agricultural intelligence, while a low-level informant in the State Department suddenly found himself being paid enough to buy a house. The confusion reached farcical levels when the accounting department sent a bill for surveillance equipment to an American physicist who wasn't even aware he was being watched. The physicist, thinking it was some kind of elaborate prank, mailed the bill back with a note suggesting the KGB might want to invest in better bookkeeping software. The operation was saved only when a senior KGB officer noticed that their most important atomic intelligence was coming from an agent whose official file listed his profession as chicken farmer. Technology promised to revolutionize espionage, but sometimes created problems that were worse than the ones it solved. During the 1980s, the NSA developed a sophisticated computer system designed to analyze patterns in intercepted communications and automatically flag potentially important conversations. The system was fed thousands of hours of recorded phone calls, radio transmissions, and other communications, with the goal of identifying threats to national security. The computer was programmed to recognize certain keywords and phrases that might indicate espionage or terrorist activity. Unfortunately, the programmers didn't account for the creative ways people use language in everyday conversation. The system flagged a cooking show for suspicious activity because the host kept talking about bringing down the temperature and eliminating the competition. A children's birthday party was marked as a potential terrorist meeting because someone mentioned blowing out the candles and making things explode with flavor. The system became so overwhelmed with false positives that analysts stopped paying attention to its alerts, missing several genuinely suspicious conversations while investigating threats from cooking enthusiasts and party planners. The human cost of espionage failures wasn't always measured in lives lost or secrets stolen, but sometimes in careers destroyed by simple misunderstandings. Aldrich Ames, one of the most damaging double agents in CIA history, managed to spy for the Soviet Union for nearly a decade, partly because his colleagues misinterpreted obvious warning signs. Ames lived far beyond his CIA salary, driving expensive cars and buying a house that cost more than he should have been able to afford. His explanation that his wife had family money was accepted without serious investigation, even though the amounts involved were clearly excessive. The real tragedy was that several CIA officers did notice Ames's suspicious lifestyle, but their reports got lost in bureaucratic shuffling. One analyst wrote a detailed memo outlining his concerns about Ames's finances, but it was filed under the wrong classification level and never reached the appropriate investigators. Another officer tried to raise concerns about Ames's behavior during meetings, but his supervisor assumed it was a personal grudge and ignored the warnings. By the time anyone took the suspicions seriously, Ames had already caused irreparable damage to American intelligence operations and gotten several agents killed. Some espionage disasters were the result of overconfidence rather than incompetence, but the results were equally devastating. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was based on the assumption that the Cuban people would rise up against Castro as soon as American-backed forces landed on the island. This assumption was so deeply held that planners didn't bother developing contingency plans for what would happen if the uprising failed to materialize. The invasion force was equipped and trained for a quick victory, followed by popular support, not for the prolonged guerrilla warfare that actually ensued. When the expected uprising didn't happen, the invaders found themselves trapped on the beaches with no backup plan and no way to retreat. The disaster was compounded by communication failures that left the invasion force unable to coordinate with their CIA handlers, and by political restrictions that prevented American forces from providing direct support. The result was a humiliating defeat that strengthened Castro's position and damaged American credibility throughout Latin America. The most dangerous intelligence failures were often the ones that almost triggered larger conflicts. During the 1983 Able Archer exercise, NATO forces conducted a realistic simulation of nuclear warfare that was so convincing it nearly sparked an actual nuclear exchange. Soviet intelligence had been warning for months that the United States was preparing a surprise nuclear attack, and the realistic nature of the exercise seemed to confirm their worst fears. Soviet nuclear forces were placed on high alert, and some commanders were reportedly given authority to launch retaliatory strikes if they lost contact with Moscow. The situation was made worse by communication intercepts that showed NATO forces discussing nuclear targeting and launch procedures, not realizing that these conversations were part of the simulation rather than actual war planning. The crisis was diffused only when Soviet intelligence finally realized that the exercise was indeed just an exercise. But for several days, the world came closer to nuclear war than most people realized at the time. Even the most carefully planned operations could be undone by factors that seemed too absurd to be real. In the 1970s, the CIA developed a plan to gather intelligence on Soviet submarine technology by secretly recovering a sunken Soviet submarine from the Pacific Ocean floor. The operation, known as Project Azorian, required building a massive ship equipped with sophisticated lifting equipment, all while maintaining the cover story that it was a deep-sea mining vessel. The project took years to develop and cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but the recovery operation itself was a masterpiece of engineering and deception. The problem came after the submarine was successfully raised, when CIA analysts realized that the most important intelligence wasn't in the submarine's technology, but in the personal effects of the crew members. Letters, diaries, and photographs provided unprecedented insights into the daily lives and attitudes of Soviet submariners, information that proved far more valuable than the submarine's outdated equipment. However, this treasure trove of human intelligence was nearly lost because the CIA had focused so heavily on the technical aspects of the operation that they'd barely planned for processing and analyzing personal materials. The psychology of espionage created its own unique category of failures, as agents and handlers struggled with the mental toll of living double lives. The CIA's MK-Ultra program, designed to develop techniques for mind control and interrogation, produced more psychological casualties among its own personnel than useful intelligence. Researchers working on the program began exhibiting symptoms of paranoia and dissociation, unable to distinguish between their experimental subjects and their own altered states of consciousness. Some agents who volunteered for LSD experiments suffered permanent psychological damage, while others became so convinced of the effectiveness of mind control techniques that they began seeing evidence of Soviet brainwashing everywhere. The program's most dangerous legacy wasn't the drugs or the torture techniques, but the culture of paranoia it created within the intelligence community, where officers began suspecting their own colleagues of being compromised or controlled. These failures demonstrate that even the most sophisticated intelligence operations are vulnerable to the same human weaknesses that plague any other enterprise: poor communication, bureaucratic incompetence, overconfidence, and simple bad luck. The difference is that when spies make mistakes, the consequences can be measured not just in wasted money or embarrassment, but in lives lost and international crises narrowly averted. The history of espionage is ultimately a history of human fallibility, played out on a stage where the stakes are often matters of life and death. Looking at our growing collection of catastrophic intelligence failures, let's continue our journey through the Hall of Shame with more examples of espionage incompetence that would be comical if they weren't so dangerous. Our next blunder takes us to the height of the Cold War, where the CIA's obsession with mind control led to one of the most ethically bankrupt and scientifically worthless programs in intelligence history. MKUltra wasn't just morally reprehensible, it was also a spectacular failure that consumed vast resources while producing absolutely nothing of value. The program involved dosing unsuspecting subjects with LSD, conducting illegal experiments on mental patients, and pursuing the fantasy of creating Manchurian candidates through psychological manipulation. The CIA spent decades and millions of dollars chasing science fiction, all while violating every ethical principle imaginable. When congressional investigations finally exposed the program, it became clear that 20 years of illegal experimentation had yielded zero practical applications. The agency had essentially funded a horror show masquerading as research, proving that moral bankruptcy and professional incompetence often go hand in hand. The British intelligence services weren't immune to their own brand of spectacular failure, as demonstrated by the Cambridge 5 spy ring that operated for decades under their noses. Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross managed to penetrate the highest levels of British intelligence and government, feeding secrets to the Soviet Union for years. The warning signs were everywhere, from Burgess's notorious drinking and erratic behavior to Philby's suspicious activities. Yet the old boys' network protected them through sheer class solidarity and institutional blindness. When Burgess and MacLean finally fled to Moscow in 1951, the British establishment's response was damage control rather than serious investigation. Philby continued operating as a double agent for another 12 years, even serving as a liaison with the CIA while secretly working for the KGB. The scandal revealed how easily personal relationships and social connections could compromise national security when institutional loyalty trumped professional competence. Moving to more recent history, the weapons of mass destruction intelligence failure that preceded the Iraq War stands as perhaps the most consequential intelligence blunder of the modern era. Multiple intelligence agencies across several countries convinced themselves that Saddam Hussein possessed active WMD programs, despite thin evidence and contradictory reports. The infamous slam dunk assessment was built on shaky sources, including unreliable informants with obvious motives to lie and satellite imagery that was misinterpreted to support predetermined conclusions. Intelligence analysts were under enormous political pressure to provide evidence supporting military action, leading to confirmation bias on an institutional scale. When weapons inspectors found nothing and post-invasion searches came up empty, it became clear that the intelligence community had failed catastrophically. The consequences extended far beyond professional embarrassment, contributing to a war that destabilized an entire region and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The FBI's surveillance of civil rights leaders represents another dark chapter in intelligence incompetence, where political paranoia overrode both legal constraints and basic competence. J. Edgar Hoover's obsession with Martin Luther King Jr. led to years of illegal wiretapping and harassment that revealed nothing more threatening than personal indiscretions. The Bureau spent enormous resources trying to prove that the civil rights movement was communist-controlled, ignoring actual threats while pursuing political enemies. The COINTELPRO operations were not only illegal and unconstitutional, but also counterproductive, often strengthening the movements they were designed to disrupt. When these programs were finally exposed, they severely damaged the FBI's credibility and revealed how easily intelligence agencies could become tools of political oppression rather than national security. The Aldrich Ames case exposed fundamental flaws in CIA counterintelligence procedures that allowed a Soviet mole to operate for nearly a decade while living far beyond his means. Ames sold the identities of Soviet agents working for the CIA, leading to numerous executions and the complete collapse of American intelligence networks in the Soviet Union. Despite his lavish lifestyle, including expensive cars and a $500,000 house purchased on a CIA salary, his colleagues and supervisors noticed nothing suspicious. The agency's polygraph tests, background checks, and financial monitoring all failed to detect the most damaging spy in CIA history. When Ames was finally arrested in 1994, it became clear that basic security procedures had been ignored for years, allowing a drunken, disgruntled employee to devastate American intelligence operations. The intelligence failures surrounding the September 11th attacks revealed systemic problems that went far beyond any single mistake. Multiple agencies possessed pieces of information that, if properly shared and analyzed, might have prevented the attacks. The CIA knew that al-Qaeda operatives had entered the United States, but failed to share this information with the FBI. The FBI had field reports about suspicious flight training activities, but didn't connect them to broader terrorist threats. Immigration authorities processed visa applications without adequate screening, and aviation security remained laughably inadequate despite known threats. The failure wasn't just about missing specific clues, but about fundamental institutional dysfunction that prevented effective coordination between agencies. Bureaucratic turf wars, information hoarding, and technological incompatibility created a system that was designed to fail when faced with sophisticated threats. One particularly absurd example of Cold War paranoia was the CIA's extensive surveillance of writers and intellectuals, including a decades-long file on author John Steinbeck. The agency apparently considered the author of The Grapes of Wrath a potential security threat, monitoring his activities and correspondence for evidence of communist sympathies. This literary surveillance program consumed resources that could have been used for actual counterintelligence work while producing nothing more valuable than book reports. The fact that intelligence professionals spent time analyzing novels for subversive content reveals how far removed from reality these operations had become. The case of Ana Montes, the Cuban spy who worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency for 16 years, demonstrates how personal ideology can overcome institutional safeguards. Montes had access to highly classified information about U.S. military capabilities and intelligence operations, which she systematically passed to Cuban intelligence. Despite her obvious pro-Cuban sympathies and her brother's career as an FBI counterintelligence agent, she was never seriously investigated until a routine polygraph examination raised suspicions. Her case revealed that the DIA's personnel security procedures were inadequate for detecting ideologically motivated spies, especially those who didn't fit the typical profile of financially motivated traitors. The intelligence community's handling of the anthrax attacks following 9/11 was another exercise in investigative incompetence that destroyed an innocent man's life, while the real perpetrator remained free for years. The FBI's obsession with Dr. Stephen Hatfill, a biodefense researcher, led to years of public harassment and surveillance, despite the complete absence of evidence linking him to the attacks. Meanwhile, the actual perpetrator, Dr. Bruce Ivins, continued working in the same laboratory where the anthrax was produced. The Bureau's tunnel vision and media leaks not only derailed the investigation, but also resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement when Hatfield sued for defamation. When Ivins finally committed suicide in 2008, the FBI claimed vindication, but serious questions remained about their evidence and investigative methods. The NSA's mass surveillance programs revealed through Edward Snowden's disclosures showed how technological capabilities had far outpaced legal frameworks and institutional oversight. The agency had constructed a vast surveillance apparatus that collected enormous amounts of data on American citizens without producing proportional security benefits. Despite having access to unprecedented amounts of communication data, the NSA failed to prevent numerous terrorist attacks, including the Boston Marathon bombing. The programs were not only legally questionable, but also operationally ineffective, drowning analysts in irrelevant information while missing actual threats. The intelligence value of bulk collection proved to be minimal, while the damage to international relationships and public trust was enormous. Perhaps most embarrassingly, the CIA's efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro read like a collection of rejected spy movie plots. The agency considered exploding cigars, poisoned milkshakes, and even a scheme involving a contaminated diving suit. They recruited mafia figures, developed exotic toxins, and spent years plotting increasingly elaborate schemes, all of which failed spectacularly. These assassination attempts were not only unsuccessful, but also counterproductive, providing Castro with propaganda victories and justification for his own repressive measures. The revelation of these plots during congressional investigations in the 1970s severely damaged the CIA's reputation and credibility. The pattern that emerges from these failures is depressingly consistent. Institutional arrogance, confirmation bias, political pressure, bureaucratic dysfunction, and a fundamental disconnect from reality. Whether it's the fantasy of mind control, the paranoia of political surveillance, or the technological hubris of mass data collection, intelligence agencies repeatedly fall victim to their own assumptions and prejudices. The human element remains the weakest link in even the most sophisticated operations, and the consequences of these failures extend far beyond the intelligence community to affect international relations, public policy, and individual lives. These failures serve as a sobering reminder that intelligence work, despite its mystique and technological sophistication, remains fundamentally human and therefore fallible. The stakes are too high for the kind of systematic failures we've examined, yet they continue to occur with depressing regularity. Each new scandal promises reform and accountability, but the fundamental problems persist. Secrecy breeds incompetence, power corrupts judgment, and institutional interests often override national security concerns. Until intelligence agencies can overcome these inherent challenges, we can expect more spectacular failures to join this hall of shame.